Okay. Let's take a second. Okay, so this is our last of the lectures on ancient Greece. So you should have already watched the first three. The last one was about the Acropolis, so make sure that you watch those. And as I click through to get to the slide we're actually starting at today, you have a slight review. So the first one, we have the geometrical and orientalizing movements, and then we talk about the Archaic period. And then we talk about architecture in the Archaic, and then we get into the transition into the Classical period. So there's a lecture on that, and then we get into early and high Classical, and then after that we talk about Polykleitos quite a while. Then there's a whole lecture just on the buildings of the Acropolis, where we look at these 4 buildings. And and now we're in the late Classical period. Okay, so in this period we are mostly going to talk about these 3 sculptors, and then we're going to look at the Hellenistic period as well. So one of the things to kind of tell you what's going on historically at this time when we're moving into the late Classical period is we have the Peloponnesian Wars. So this is very disruptive. As we've talked about before, we had the Delphian League, which was all of the Greek city-states that kind of banded together to support each other and to drive out the Persians, right? So then Athens decided they were kind of the most important of those city-states, and they moved the treasury of that group to Athens. And then Pericles, who was the leader of Athens at the time, decided to use all of that money that had been pooled together by all these Greek city-states for future defense funds. He decided to use that to redo the Acropolis, right? Well, then the Peloponnesian War happens. Athens gets absolutely crushed by Sparta. Part of this is that they've sort of sown this discontent within the other Greek city-states like Sparta, because Athens kind of took over everything, right? And then they used the money in a way that most of the other people felt was inappropriate, because it wasn't for their collective good as a defense fund. Instead, it's to beautify this one area in Athens. So Sparta is mad about this and other things, and they attack Athens, and Athens gets absolutely crushed. As we've talked about a few times, Sparta's kind of, you don't really want to mess with Sparta. Sparta's, they're kind of hardcore warriors, and so they come in and beat Athens. And then Thebes becomes the big power. Thebes, you can see on the map right there, just east of Athens. They kind of take over, and they're like the new leaders of all the Greek city-states, basically. And then the Greeks are like, oh no, the Persians are coming again. Let's work together. So the Greeks kind of try to reform these bonds, but because of the infighting, they're not as strong as they were, and they lose, okay? And so then Greece is in this much weakened state. And in this weakened state, the Macedonian king takes over. And the king at this time of Macedonia is Philip II, and you can see Macedonia is up there just north of Greece. And so when Philip II is king, he's king until he dies in 336 BC. And this map shows everything that was their territory at the time of his death. So he's conquered quite a lot, Philip II. He has not just Macedonia, but he has Greece, he has this big chunk up here, he has most of this area except Epirus, that's their big ally, so it's essentially part of their empire, basically. You'll notice the unconquered Greek territory down at the bottom is Sparta, right? Don't mess with Sparta. So this is how it stands at the time when Philip II, king of the Macedonians, dies. And he is succeeded by his son, who most of you have probably heard of before. His son is Alexander III. He's more commonly known as Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is known as Alexander the Great because he kind of takes over everything. He is definitely an empire builder. So the orange part of this map is what Alex the Great takes over. So his dad did a pretty good job over there around, Greece and Turkey and the Aegean, but you can see that he pushes his territory very much further. So he overthrows the Persians on their home turf. So not only does he kick them out of Greece, he is able to defeat them on their home turf and take over their area, which is not a thing we've seen from anyone in the Greek area before. And he also conquers Egypt, which is hard to do. That's a pretty big deal. And he extends this all the way over to where he's even in part of northern India. So this is a pretty major conquest. This is a big empire that he builds. During all of this upheaval, the Greeks kind of shift their focus from the ideas of the perfect and the ideal, which are things that, as we talked about last time, they were very interested in and were working on portraying in their architecture as well as in their sculpture. So they sort of shift away from this idea of what's perfect, what's ideal, figuring out these mathematical ratios to make everything as close to perfect as possible. And they start becoming interested in individuals and in the real world, and making things naturalistic and realistic, not to an ideal standard, but flawed, and looking even more real in that they are flawed. Okay, so during this time, we see the emergence of three great sculptors that are the very important kind of voices of this late classical period. So the first one is Procitalis. And so Procitalis is a sculptor in the 4th century BC in Greece. And he has this commission to make a sculpture of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, right? And if you recall, well, let's just look at this sculpture for a minute. What strikes you immediately about this that is very different than all of the sculptures of women we've seen so far in all of ancient Greece? She's naked, right? She's nude, which we see lots of naked guys, but we haven't seen nudity in women, even in the goddesses. So this is kind of scandalous. This is a little bit controversial. So he gets this commission to make this sculpture of Aphrodite, and he sees this as an opportunity to kind of showcase what he's interested in. And he's interested in this naturalistic kind of portrayal of the human body, not as an ideal, but as perfectly human, even the gods. So this idea of humanizing the gods and goddesses and taking on this kind of worldly sensuousness, right? And really appealing to the senses. So he creates this sculpture that is still very beautiful, but she isn't so stiff, she isn't so perfect, she's not mathematically sorted out like ratio. He's most likely working from a model, from a real person, to create this otherworldly subject, this goddess. And so up to this point, we aren't seeing women nude in sculpture, so that's one of the things that's the most shocking about this. And it's actually rejected. It's rejected by the people who initially commissioned it. But then this city called Knidos, which is spelled right there for you, Knidos, they decide that they're going to buy it and they're going to put it in their main central square, and it's going to make their town famous. So one of the interesting stories about this sculpture is that at this time we don't necessarily think about tourism being a thing, but the town of Knidos basically bought this so that it would be a tourist attraction. So it was very controversial. It's by this great sculptor of the time. It's a nude woman. So they thought lots of people would come to see this because of all the controversy around it, and they're right. It kind of puts them on the map. So people go out of their way to travel to see this sculpture, which is pretty large. It's 6 feet 8 inches tall, so it's larger than life size, right? So it becomes this thing that people come to see it, and people love it. They kind of fall in love with it, and they're very amazed by Procitalis' ability to transform marble into the soft, radiant flesh that looks like a person. It looks soft. It doesn't look like hard stone. So this one is kind of a big deal. The original is lost to us, unfortunately. We only have Roman copies. There's every reason to believe these are pretty accurate Roman copies, but here is a Roman copy of this sculpture. One of the other big artists at this time, which one of you, by the way, in the discussion post will write about another of Procitalis' famous works, which is the sculpture of Hermes and Dionysus. So look to your discussion post, students in my art history class, for that. One of the other big artists of the time is a little bit different. So we have this emergence of these individual styles that are particular to each artist, which is something we saw a little bit in some of the ceramic painters and some of the vase painters, but they were mostly just kind of copying each other, right? And that's been true for sculptors and architects as well. But here we have sort of the beginning of these really individualized kind of styles within this time period. So Procitalis, who we were just looking at, is known for kind of sensuous, dreamy looking kind of figures. And this artist is Scopas, and this is one of his more famous works, Meleager, which was made in 340 BC. The original was bronze, not marble, but it's lost to time, like so many of these Greek sculptors. But we have many written descriptions of it, and then we have lots of Roman copies. Here are two of the Roman copies in marble. So you can see the copies are pretty true to form. You can see that they're similar. There's a little bit of variation, but they're fairly similar in terms of the way that they're created. Scopas was also an architect. Meleager, the subject of this, was the host of the Caledonian boar hunt, which figures into a lot of the myths, a lot of the stories of the time. It's one of the great kind of adventure legends. And so Artemis sent the boar, Artemis the goddess of the moon and the hunt, and the goal was to kill it. And the person who ends up killing it in this like story that Meleager is from is Atalanta, who's a woman, or she doesn't kill it, I'm sorry. She's the first to wound it. She's the first to draw blood, and so she wins, like, there's some kind of prize for first to draw blood and the person to kill it and all that. So it's kind of a neat story in that a woman does something other than be kidnapped in it, which is a lot of the Greek stories. So she's kind of this great hunter, so it's kind of a neat sort of feminist story, I guess. Anyway, so Scopas becomes known for intense emotionalism. That is the thing that he is known for. And in this sculpture, this copy, we can see that we do have kind of an emotional face. Look at the shape of his eyebrows, look at his expression. But a lot of his work, which is mostly lost to time, apparently was extremely expressive and extremely kind of over the top and intensely emotional. He also created the tomb for Mausoleus, which was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world, and that's where we get the word mausoleum, is from that tomb, which was created by this artist Scopas. So he's kind of the second big guy from the classical period. The third and final really important sculptor from this period is Lycipus, and so he has some pretty famous commissions. He's commissioned to do Alexander the Great's official portrait, his official statue. And one of the things that he's quite famous for is he introduces new proportions. So we see new proportions being introduced at this time. And you know, last time we were talking about Polykleitos, and so Polykleitos wrote Canon and made that demonstration sculpture of the spear bearer, which showed his idea of what the perfect and ideal proportions were. So Lycipus changes that. He decides that the head of the body should be equal to 1/8 of the body, not 1/7, which doesn't sound like a huge difference, but it's kind of a huge difference. It throws all the proportions into a totally different alignment. So that's kind of a big deal. And he has a couple of very famous sculptures. One of you is writing about apoxiomenos. That's the word for the scraper, and it's an athlete scraping the oil off his body, so we'll read about that in the discussion. This is another one of his famous works. This is Weary Heracles. So Heracles, of course, is the great hero, which we've talked about him a lot, about his 12 labors. This is a depiction of him that's fairly typical in terms of the attributes, the things that tell us that this is Heracles. So you'll notice we have the skin of a lion hanging there. That's the Nemean lion, which was killing the Nemean lion was one of his 12 labors. And then you'll see he's holding apples behind his back. And this is, again, from the 12 labors, the stealing of the golden apples, right? So these are some attributes that the contemporaries of Lycipus would have recognized that this is Heracles. And one of the things that I think is extremely clever about the way he does this is he has Heracles hold the apples behind his back. So this is a sculpture in the round. all of the sculpture we've looked at so far in ancient Greece has been either in the round or relief sculpture, which means it's attached, right? So it's carved out of like a pediment or something, but it's attached to the wall. So when it's in the round, you can walk all the way around it. But a lot of people at the time are making sculptures in the round that then sit against a wall or sit inside a little alcove in a wall. And Lycipus thinks that if you're going to make something in the round, you should take full advantage of that, and you should have people look at it from every angle, because that's part of what's significant and different about a sculpture in the round versus in a relief sculpture. So he kind of puts this little Easter egg in where he has this little nod to this other part of the myth with the apples being held behind the back, so that people who walk all the way around it to see how all of his new ideas about proportions and naturalism and the way the body is portrayed get to see this other little allusion to myth. So it's kind of a neat little thing that he's sort of snuck in there. Sorry, this thing is popping up for no reason. Okay, so those are the three big sculptors of the High Classical period. So we have Procitalis, we have Scopas, and we have Lycipus. So now we're going to talk about Alexander the Great's Macedonian court for a while. So the Macedonian court of Alex the Great is very, very rich, and they employ many artists. So they have some people who are artists who are just working for them, who only do commissions for them for their court, which is something that's pretty typical as we progress further along in history. We'll learn about lots of different court artists, court painters, court sculptors, things like this. But this is one of the earlier times that we see this. So these are the Pella mosaics. So this is a mosaic made from pebbles, from little individual stones. So this is not a painting. This is constructed from placing little tiny stones next to each other to create this image, and getting just the right colors and just the right size to portray this image. This is the earliest signed mosaic that we have. It says on it, Gnosis made it, so we know the name of the artist was Gnosis, which is a pretty cool name for an artist. And this is a portrayal of a stag hunt. So this is people on a hunt killing this stag or deer. It's quite large. It's 10 feet 2 inches high or long, and it was set in the floor. And in this we see an example of skiagraphia. Skiagraphia is one of those words that's kind of fun to say. It literally means shadow painting. So even though this is not a painting, it is a mosaic, we see attention to value being shown to make this look three-dimensional. So we can see some shadows around the defined musculature of the figures in this, and of the dog and the deer. And the word for that in Greek is skiagraphia. Okay, so we start seeing more use of mosaic as an art form at the Macedonian courts at this time, and then this spreads outward from there and becomes very popular in lots of places in the Alex the Great's empire. So all over Eastern Europe and the Middle East, we start seeing more and more attention to mosaic as an art form. So this is a tile work by Philoxenos. It's the Battle of Issus. It was made in 310 BC. This is actually a Roman copy of that mosaic. So it was a mosaic by a Greek guy named Philoxenos, and then it was copied by a Roman artist, and it is, this example by the Roman artist is in the House of the Faun, which is in Pompeii, Italy. When we get into the Roman Empire, we'll talk about Pompeii quite a bit. And it was made in the late 2nd century, so the copy was made a little later. And it's a tessera mosaic. And the difference between that and this, so this is made out of little stones, little pebbles. This is made out of tessera, which are little individual ceramic tiles that have been painted or glazed, okay? So when we think of mosaic now, if you think of mosaic, you maybe think of the kind that's the little tile work all set together. So that's what this is. And those individual tiles are called tessera, okay? So this is a tessera mosaic, and the original mosaic was also a copy. It was a copy of a painting by Helena of Egypt. The subject of this painting was the Battle of Issus. This is a battle between Alexander the Great and Darius III. So Darius III was the Persian king at the time, and we have Alexander the Great coming in on his horse. His horse's name was Bucephalus. He's a very famous horse. And so Alex the Great and Bucephalus ride in and attack Darius III, the Persian king, who's in the chariot here. And it's this epic battle. Alexander the Great wins. It's a very important historical battle because it's Alexander the Great winning on the Persians' home turf and really expanding his empire. One of the things that's super interesting about this is, first of all, we have beautiful depth and perspective where everything is overlapping. We can see that these are three-dimensional figures. It's a very complicated work with a lot of action going on, a lot of complicated figures interacting with each other, with the horses and the men, and it's done pretty realistically. It's pretty beautiful, and knowing that this was a painting that existed is neat. And one of the other things that I think is particularly cool is that this was a painting by a woman. So we don't know the names of that many artists from this time, and the ones that we do know are all men, with very few exceptions. So Helena of Egypt, she was active during the 4th century BC in Egypt, and she was a painter who learned how to paint from her dad. Her dad, Timon, was also a painter, and she worked in the period right after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. Pliny the Elder, who's one of the most famous historians that we know a lot about this ancient world from because he wrote everything down, he wrote many books, and he wrote that the Battle of Issus was Helena's only recorded work. The only other information on Helena of Egypt exists in the encyclopedic work Bibliotheca by Photios I. And so Photios I is someone who lived in Constantinople, so in a little bit east, and he kind of made the first encyclopedia, basically. He made this book called Bibliotheca that was kind of a record of significant people and places and things during this time period. And there aren't that many women. People are just listed by name, and the Helens that are listed are Helen of Troy and then Helena of Egypt, who's the painter. And in it he says, and Helen the female painter also belongs to the list. She was the daughter of Timon the Egyptian. She painted the Battle of Issus at the time when she was at the height of her powers. And I really like that phrasing. Instead of saying at the peak of her career or at the when she was in her best talent or something like this, the height of her powers. So someday when I die, feel free to memorialize things that I do as being at the height of my powers because I think that that's pretty cool. So I just like to make a bigger note on this one. It's a significant piece in and of itself, but it's also significant that we have this early record of a woman artist, which implies that there were more female artists, right, than we originally thought that simply weren't recorded. So it's always nice looking back in history to find things like that and examples of more marginalized groups making work at the time. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about architecture. So we talked about Polykleitos quite extensively earlier in his spear bearer sculpture and his writing of the work canon, which kind of determined the ideal sculptural proportions in sculptures of the human body at the time. So he has a son, and his son is Polykleitos the Younger, and his son is an architect, and he's kind of an important architect because he, if not being the originator, is one of the earlier most architects to work in some pretty important areas. So one of them is he creates amphitheaters, okay? So he starts creating these theaters that I associate with the Romans, a little with the Greeks, but also with the Romans, where we have these kind of stadium seating, and then we have this orchestra section at the bottom where the performance would be, the musical performance or the theater performance or whatever was happening that night. And these become quite popular. We start seeing these all over the place, like I said, especially in the Roman Empire, but at this later part, the Hellenistic period of the Greeks, we also see this. And so he's one of the earlier architects to do this kind of design. And so we have these two sections here. The bottom section with the sand there is called the orchestra, and that's literally the word orchestra means dancing place, which is kind of fun. And then the seating area is the theatron, which is the place for seeing. So a theater literally means a place to go see something. So this is one of the big contributions from Polykleitos the Younger, as we see his kind of design for theaters. The other is he's one of the earlier architects to use the Corinthian capital. So when we were talking about the Archaic period in architecture, I talked about two different orders, the Doric and the Ionic. So this is the third order of Greek architecture, of classical architecture, that comes around and becomes more popular in the following periods with the Roman Empire, and that's the Corinthian order. So one of the main distinguishing points of it is the Corinthian capital. And you'll notice it has swirly volutes like an Ionic capital, but it has several. It has some that come out this way, it has some that go in, and then it has all these kind of floral like leaf work, and it's much more elaborate and much more decorated. So this is when we start seeing the Corinthian capital, and this is, like I said, one of the early adapters of this kind of capital was Polykleitos the Younger. Okay, now let's get into the Hellenistic period. So in the Hellenistic period, we kind of just have more. Everything gets more kind of amped up and a little more elaborate, a little more dramatic. So we have, this is the Temple of Apollo. It was made by Paeonios of Ephesus and Aphinas of Miletos. And so it was worked on off and on for a very long period of time, and it's kind of a deviation from the previous temple structures that we've seen in the classical Greek period. So this is in Turkey, which at this point is part of Greece, part of Macedonia, Greece, you know, and it was Ionic, kind of, so it had Ionic columns. But you can see from the plan that there's many, many more columns, okay? So we have multiple rows of columns that go all the way around the stylobite. We have more columns as you enter the temple. You also only enter from one direction. There isn't anything coming in the back, so it's not as symmetrical as things that we saw in the classical period. So it's just become more elaborate. It has more columns everywhere. The other thing is this is what is called a hypaethral temple, and that just means that it was open to the sky. So it didn't have a roof, it was open to the sky, and the idea is kind of you're letting the gods into the temple, right? Because they live up above. So this is what's left of the Temple of Apollo. It also didn't have a pediment, and it didn't really have a formal cella or naos in this middle section. It's really just all of these columns around an open courtyard. So it's this very different kind of open air design. So that's why I say it's kind of Ionic. We have Ionic columns, but we have way more of them, and we don't have all the other classical elements of the Ionic order, like a pediment, like a naos or cella, like a ceiling, that kind of thing. Okay, the other thing we see during this time period is more development in the secular architecture. And by secular, I mean non-religious, right? So not just talking about developments in temples, but also just in kind of city planning, the way cities were designed. So we get more of this where the city is all kind of designed at once. So up in the upper left here, I have a typical home in a Greek city-state at this time. So what Perrine Italy, or Perrine Turkey, excuse me, is an example of this. So this is a pretty typical home. You'd have an open air kind of courtyard. You'd have bed chambers. You'd have kind of an eating area, that kind of thing. But they're kind of standardized. It's almost like suburbia now. So you have these kind of standard plans for houses all the way throughout. The other thing you'll notice, if you look at the plan below in the three-dimensional rendering up above, you can see that the temple is up in the upper left, and the thing that's in the center of the city is not the temple, it's the marketplace. So we have, this is called the stoas, S-T-O-A-S. So the individual stoa are the stalls where, you know, like the butcher would have meat here, and the person who grows vegetables would have a thing here, and the person who weaves cloth would have a thing here. So it's this market that has a big square in the middle that's open, and then all these columns you see around here, those are all the individual stalls where the people selling things would be. So the center of the city that it's all built around becomes the market where people get the goods they need, rather than being the temple being the city center. So the temple is present, it is an important presence, but the market is really what everything is built around. You also see there's a theater up above, so you see the way everything is kind of designed and planned, which is kind of interesting and a little different. Another kind of structure from this time period, which is very different and kind of strange, is this. So this is the altar of Zeus. Altar is a strange word for this, because it's really a building. It's kind of a building, it's kind of a building, it's kind of a monument, it's kind of a sculpture. It reminds me a little bit, the thing that I think is most similar to the altar of Zeus that's sort of familiar to us as Americans today is, if anyone's been to DC and been to the Lincoln Memorial, you know how it's like, it has steps, you can walk up to it, you can kind of go in it, but so it's not exactly a sculpture, but it's not exactly a building, it's kind of just this thing that you can walk up to. It's like a monument, you can walk up the steps, walk around in it, but it's not exactly a building. So this is sort of like that. This is the altar of Zeus, so it's dedicated to Zeus. And it portrays in this, I guess we'll call it a frieze that goes all the way around the bottom there. It portrays the battle of the gods against the giants. So Zeus and his family of gods basically battling the giants. The gods win, they defeat the giants. So in this detail shot I have up to the left here, we have Athena. She's grabbing a giant by the hair. We're kind of missing her face, but she's grabbing him by the hair. He looks like he's in a lot of pain. We have Gaia down below. She's the earth goddess who was the mother of all the giants. So she's looking on and looking up to Athena, kind of hurting one of her sons, one of the giants, and her eyes seem like she's kind of distraught. So we see in these portrayals in this sculpture all around this monument, this altar to Zeus, there's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of like agony, a lot of people writhing in pain, there's very emotional looks on the faces of the gods and the giants. So it's again this idea that comes over from high classical and kind of gets even more pumped up, even more exacerbated in the Hellenistic period, which is this idea of intense emotion, intense emotionalism. Okay, so some other examples of this that we're going to look at in the discussion are some sculptures that deal with the victory of the Greeks over the Gauls. So we see a lot of portrayals of dying enemies who are just in a lot of pain and a lot of agony, and there's lots of emotion. Okay, so this next sculpture that we're going to look at is one of the most famous sculptures in the world. It's at the Louvre in Paris currently, and it's very striking. So when you go to the Louvre, as I hope you all will one day, there's in this little guide, at least when I went there, which it's now been, gosh, not quite 20 years since I was last in Paris, which is sad. I obviously need to go back. So there's all kinds of guidebooks and things, and there's this one little guide that has like the highlights. So the Louvre is one of the largest museums in the world. If you spent 30 seconds in front of each piece of art in the Louvre, you would be there for 3 months straight, 24 hours a day. That's how big it is, so it's massive. So there's this one guidebook that kind of points out the things that everybody wants to see, the highlights. When you hear Louvre, you probably think Mona Lisa. That's the most famous piece of art there. And then one of the other highlighted pieces is this, and one of the other ones is another sculpture that we're going to look at in just a minute. So this is the Nike of Samothrace. And Nike, as we talked about before when we were talking about the Acropolis, Nike is the winged victory, and she is sometimes considered sort of a manifestation of Athena, one of Athena's sort of manifestations. They're related, at least. And this piece is so incredible, and I remember the first time I was at the Louvre when I think I was a teenager, and I was surprised that something this famous was in the stairwell. I thought that was kind of weird, but it really it's really beautiful there. So you come up these massive stairs, and as you turn the corner to go up the stairs, there it is, just at the top, on top of its ship, kind of glowing and really well lit and sort of rising up over the stairs. And it's really very impactful and quite beautiful. So I just wanted to show you that kind of in context piece, and then here are some detail works of it. So this is Nike alighting on a warship. It was found in Samothrace, so it's Nike of Samothrace, Greece. It's made in 190 BC, and it's 8 feet 1 inches tall. That's just the statue, not the ship part. And it's at the Louvre. And I always ask my students when I teach this in seated classes why they think this is so famous. Why is this one of the pieces that's in the little guidebook that if you're just going to hit the highlights at the Louvre, this is one of the must-sees and one of the most famous sculptures in the world, one of the things everyone wants to see. And it's kind of a hard question to ask. People say lots of different things. It's always really interesting. I have some ideas about it. I think one of the things that makes it really alluring is that it's sort of mysterious. She's missing her head. She's missing her arms. It has this incredible presence. So this thing probably weighs as much as your car. This is a very heavy piece of marble. And it's more than 8 feet of marble. So it's very, very heavy. It's very monumental. But it doesn't really appear heavy, right? It sort of looks light. It looks like it could just fly off, like she's just alighted on the ship and it's just landed. And so it has this kind of quality where it's really playing with our perception and playing with how we're going to interpret it. So it feels very light, even though we know in our heads it's heavy. It also, her being the personification of victory, you think about the people who were on this boat, who were at war, who were out fighting in the Navy and fighting these grueling, horrible battles. And when the Nike alights on your ship, it means the war's over. It means the war's over, and it means you've won. So it's this moment of kind of hope and excitement that's represented here, and I think is captured pretty well. And it has this energy, like it could just take off. It has this very kinetic kind of energy. It also, look at how it's showing us her body, but she still has this fabric that she's wearing, but she's on the prow of the ship. So that would be like salt water splashing up, all this wind, this kind of feeling. And you get that feeling, it really feels like drapery. It really feels like cloth that's gotten wet and is being blown around. And you kind of feel like you're there on the ship from looking at this. And it also has this sensual quality. We're seeing the body of this beautiful, kind of realistically portrayed woman, like this sort of ideal of beauty, but in a fairly human way. So there's just something extremely engaging about this sculpture, and I think that's why it's become so famous and has become such an essential part of the dialogue of Western art and Western sculpture. Okay, the other thing on the list of the must-sees at the Louvre is the Venus de Milo. So this is by Alexandros of Antioch on the Meander. It's Aphrodite. It becomes known as the Venus de Milo because it was found in Milos, Greece, and so the Roman version of that would be Venus de Milo, the Venus of Greece, because Venus and Aphrodite are the same thing, right? So this one is also super famous, and I also ask my students the same kind of thing, what do we think about this? And I think one of the things that's interesting about it is if we think back, let's actually just skip back and look at the famous Aphrodite of Knidos that we were looking at. So this is the first fully nude Aphrodite that we know historically, and we see this kind of soft flesh and this sort of naturalistic pose, and she's completely nude. And then we see this work, which is not completely nude, but there's something even more alluring about it. You can see that her covering is slipping down. It's falling off of her. You can see the way she's standing in this really exaggerated contrapposto, which seems like she's in motion, like she's about to take another step. There's something very soft and very sensuous and beautiful about her and her face and the way that she's portrayed. And it just has, again, this kind of like allure and appeal where it doesn't really look like marble. It looks very soft. The fabric really looks like fabric. Her hair looks like hair. And I think that it just has this kind of timeless intrigue about it that really draws people in. So it's another one that's extremely famous, and it's hard to say exactly why, but I think that that's part of it. It's just this kind of allure that it has. Moving forward, This is another piece that's really famous. That to me, this is very. This particular work kind of embodies the Hellenistic period in sculpture for me. So here we have Aphrodite, we have Eros, her son, who is the little his better known name is his Roman name, Cupid, and then we have Pan. Pan is this half goat, half man, who is the god of wildness, basically, and so he's kind of the god of the woods and wild things, and he's very sexualized, and he's always kind of up to no good. He's very mischievous. He's always making problems, and so what do we have Aphrodite doing here? First of all, this is a very clear reference. Again, I should have put just a copy of this slide up closer, but this is a very clear kind of direct reference to this sculpture. Look at the pose of the body, look at the shape of her form, and then when we look at this, we can see that this is a direct reference to that sculpture, and the sculptor would have been aware of it. It was very famous. And part of it is this idea of kind of humor and parody starts coming in the Hellenistic period. So the controversy of the Aphrodite of Knidos, which this is very clearly referencing, is that it's a naked woman, right? Well, this is a couple hundred years later. It's kind of funny that that was such a controversy. So here she is, the naked kind of Aphrodite of Knidos, covering her vaginal area, kind of, you know, but instead of just looking down and being more demure like the original sculpture, she has this lusty Pan after her, and what does she do? She's holding her sandal. She takes off her sandal to hit him with it. So she's going to smack him with her sandal to get his horny goat self off her. So it's kind of funny. It's like kind of making fun of the controversy around the nude female form that this earlier sculpture was subjected to. And there's something kind of funny about, so she's kind of smiling. Eros, who's coming and grabbing Pan's horn and trying to get him away from his mother, is also smiling. Pan's smiling. They're all kind of laughing. So it's not like, it doesn't feel like a vicious attack or anything. It's more like a, oh, stop it, you're ridiculous kind of feel. So it has this sort of playful feeling to it. And it has this sort of combination of eroticism and humor and parody. And this becomes really common in the early Hellenistic period, is this idea of humanizing the gods in a way that there's humor, there's something funny happening, and there's something sexy. So it's funny, sexy, playful kind of things, which is interesting because a lot of sculpture up to this point has been very stoic and very serious. So this is kind of like great sculptural works, mastery of skills, but can be playful too, which is kind of interesting. Another thing that we see at this time is we see an interest in not just things that are not following this really mathematical, strict kind of ideal, but portrayals of figures who aren't ideal at all. Excuse me. So we see works that portray old people, elderly people. We see works that portray drunks. We see works that portray people who are sick. So we have this kind of interest in naturalism that expands beyond just our beautiful, perfect athletes and gods and goddesses and heroes into common people, and not just common people, but people who are not so beautiful and are not so ideal, which is interesting. We haven't really seen so much of that before. So we have sculptures like this. So we have this old market woman. This is in around 150 or 100 BC. It exists at the Met in New York. And then we have an old drunk from the same time. And it's just this idea that if we're really truly interested in realism and naturalism, we have to portray people other than the perfect people also. We have to get the whole scope of humanity. So it's this new kind of interest at this time period in the Hellenistic period that we see. This is the last thing that we're going to talk about in our ancient Greek lecture, and this is the lacoon. So this is by three artists, Athenodorus, Hagiosandros, and Polydoros, all of Rhodes, and they worked on a lot of sculptures together. So beginning in the 2nd century AD, the Roman general Flaminius defeats the Macedonian army, and he declares Greece free and no longer part of this big Greek Macedonian, Alex the Great kind of leftover empire. Greece doesn't do so great. It's been under other control for a long time. And so then Greece becomes a Roman province in 146 CE, current era AD. And at that time, interest in Greek sculptors to create both copies of classical and Hellenistic work and also new work, which is called Allegreque, Alagreque, Allegreque works. In the Roman Empire, people get really interested in this. They want things that look like classical Greek works or Hellenistic Greek works. So one of the works made during this time period is this one. It's called the Laocoon, and this is a story that becomes very popular at this time. There's a lot of interest in Homer, there's a lot of interest in Ovid, there's a lot of interest in the Iliad and the Odyssey and some of these things that we've talked about before. And so this is in the Greek Trojan War, this is the Trojan priest Laocoon, okay? So Pliny the Elder, again our historian, who we have a lot of information because of him, attributes this to these three sculptors, and it's unearthed in 1506, and it is dug up and unearthed in the presence of Michelangelo. Famous guy, has a Ninja Turtle named after him. If you take art history too, we'll talk about him a lot. This was hugely influential to Michelangelo, and if you're familiar with any of his sculptural work, you can see the influence that this would have on him. It also, like if you look at the Sistine Chapel, which he painted, lots of writhing bodies, lots of accentuated musculature, that kind of thing. So this was hugely influential to Michelangelo. And it's found in the ruins of the palace of Emperor Titus. So Laocoon, who was this guy? Why is there the sculptor of him? What's happening? Why are snakes attacking him? What's going on? So Laocoon, he's described in a work called the Aeneid. The Aeneid is written by Virgil. And so in the Trojan War, the gods favored the Greeks in the Trojan War. And so what happens is Laocoon is a priest, and he tries to warn the Trojans and tell them not to bring in the wooden horse that's a gift that the Greeks have left. And if you know the story, the Trojans open their gate, they bring the wooden horse in, thinking it's like a gift, and then at night all the Greek soldiers jump out of the horse and attack and kill everyone, and that's how they win. Okay, so the Trojan priest, Laocoon, this guy, says, I don't think we should bring this wooden horse inside, guys. I think it's a bad idea. I don't think it's meant as a gift. I don't think it's a good thing. And they don't listen to him and they lose. Well, because the gods favored the Greeks, not the Trojans, and this guy is a priest to the gods, they are angry at him for trying to help the Trojans, even though he was Trojan and he worked for them, so it's kind of, his job. But because he was tried to help the Trojans defeat the Greeks, the gods are angry. So he goes out to the water to make his daily offering to the gods, and his two sons go with him. And the gods are angry, and so they send sea serpents to kill him and his sons. And Virgil's account, Laocoon suffers in terrible agony, and so do his sons. It's quite graphic and it's horrible. So this becomes a popular subject matter for a couple of reasons. One is in this Hellenistic period, they're very interested in depicting intense emotions, and depicting this sort of intense kind of agony and this kind of feeling is a subject matter that is favored by sculptors because it's a way to kind of show off their skills. This is also great because there's snakes involved, so making snakes out of marble and this kind of thing is showing off your very dynamic kinds of skills as a sculptor. The other thing is this is kind of a warning tale. Don't go against the gods. Don't go against whoever's in charge. This is a story that is liked by the people in charge at the time, right? So it becomes a fairly popular subject matter. This is a sculpture that currently exists in the Vatican Museum, so if you ever go to the Vatican, you can see this. And if you go see this in the Vatican Museum, then go into St. Peter's, look at the Pieta by Michelangelo, and go to the Sistine Chapel and look at all the bodies, and you can see the direct influence of this sculpture. Some of the poses are lifted directly from this, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's it for ancient Greece. Next time I will talk about the Etruscans, and then we will get into the Roman Empire. Thanks a lot, everybody.